I want to welcome all of you here tonight, and I'm so glad that you're here. And if you're one of our guests, we want you to know that we're truly glad you're here and always welcome to worship with us here at Emporia Avenue. I want to return to our series on church history, and I'm going to move from the Reformation movement to the Restoration movement tonight and talk about the early restorers. I'd like to begin with a verse from 2 Chronicles to show that the concept of restoration certainly is a biblical idea. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 1, says Josiah was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebiah from Beersheba. And Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada took 2 wives for him, and he became the father of sons and daughters. Now about that time, it came about that Joash decided to restore the house of God. It goes on here and describes his method of restoration. And it also describes a little bit about why the house of God needed restoration, because it had been neglected and abused by former kings. And then in verse 13 it said, "So the workmen labored, and repair work progressed in their hands, and they restored the house of God according to its specifications and strengthened it." This is just one of the many places where it talks about restoring something in the Bible. You know, this is a concept that we see even around us today. Very often in the newspaper, and I don't remember what section, but I think it's the Sunday paper almost every week, where there is a page that talks about restoring old automobiles. And somebody takes an automobile that's been all beat up and rusted up, and they bring it back to what it was originally, and sometimes maybe even a little better than what it was originally, with a better paint job or something. And so they restore that automobile from what it had become to what it was in its original purpose. Now, the last 4 lessons on church history were designed to give a brief overall picture of the Protestant Reformation movement in England and in Europe. This period had a great impact on Christianity and still affects almost every country in the world today in one way or another. I talked about Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and Simons and Henry VIII and others who played prominent roles in the Reformation movement beginning about the first of the 15th century, or in the 1500s. I also briefly mentioned how the Catholic Church did a few reforms during that time and consolidated, while Protestantism divided, and even those divisions splintered into more divisions. The Catholic Church gave up no doctrinal positions, while doctrinal positions written into creeds and catechisms and manuals and prayer books proliferated among the Protestant denominations that came out of that movement. Even though they had many things in common, different leaders emphasized a certain doctrinal, certain social, or certain traditional positions and built churches around those particular things. As certain leaders built positions of power around these ideas, they were not willing to give them up easily. Given the period of time in history that all of this happened, it was inevitable that it would all be transferred to America. And so, in order to talk about restoration, I want you to see what the situation was in America. So before I talk about that, I'm going to talk about denominationalism and how it was transferred to America. The Reformation movement continued to spawn more and more denominations. And these denominations split up even more and divided among themselves, and they divided over doctrines, and more creeds were written. And as they continued to divide, more and more organizations were set up to govern these particular groups. And many of these groups are synods, as they divided themselves into synods within the same church, could not even serve or fellowship one another. In other words, if you were a Presbyterian, there might be certain Presbyterians that you couldn't fellowship as a result of that. Religious persecution in Europe and opportunities in America transferred then all of this division from Europe to America. I want to look briefly at how this happened and some of the more well-known denominations that were transferred to America at that time. First of all, let me say that the Roman Catholic Church came here first. The Roman Catholic Church came with the explorers and established missions. When the countries of Spain and France and other countries explored and claimed large sections of America, the Catholic missionaries came along with many of these explorers, and so they established Catholic missions in these areas where their particular countries claimed. So they were the state church of that country, and so then they established that state church in the areas where their country claimed these sections of America. When denominationalism got here then, that came out of the Reformation movement, the Catholics were already well entrenched in these areas. But let me talk about the ones that did come. The Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, came to America. The first permanent colony from England was established in Jamestown in Virginia in 1609. They came for commercial reasons, but all of those people who came were members of the Church of England, or at least the majority of them were. The Bishop of London then appointed clergymen for the colonies that had the oversight of all the religious activities. After all, it was the state church of England, so it became the state church in the colonies that England then set up in this country in the beginning. When the colonies later broke with England, many Anglicans, or those who were members of the Church of England, took the name Episcopalian and established the Episcopal Church in America. The doctrine and organization stayed exactly the same. And so they established also William and Mary College in 1693 AD to train their ministers. If you get on the web, you can find William and Mary College still going strong in Williamsburg, Virginia. After this, there came Puritans, Separatists, and Congregationalists. The particular features or doctrine and government set forth by John Calvin and his associates took root in these European countries of Switzerland and England and Scotland and Ireland and Holland and France and Germany. And then these ideas were transferred to America and developed into about 125 distinct denominations. The parent groups were known as Puritans or Independents, Separatists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. And some of these, like Puritans, were a very generic name. For example, the Puritans differed widely in doctrine and in practice, but they had one thing in common. They wanted to purify the Church of England. And for that reason, many of them were forced out of England and came to America for that reason. The Puritans came to America on the Mayflower in 1620 from England by way of Holland and established the first congregational church, I should say, in America at Plymouth. Presbyterianism also came. The Presbyterian Church can be traced back to the work of John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. And as they divided even more, there were 9 major branches of the Presbyterian Church that transferred here to America. And as I said earlier, some of those didn't even fellowship some of the other branches of the same group called Presbyterians. And then the Methodists came. John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield established societies in the Church of England when they were there in England. And in America, these societies sprang up in the midst of the Episcopalian churches, which were still really connected to the Church of England. So John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield all came to America and preached in America at one time or another and established these societies throughout the colonies. Now, since they had no ordained clergy, they had to depend on the Episcopal clergy to administer the Lord's Supper and baptisms and marriage and bury the dead, which they considered to be sacraments. And so they had to go to the Episcopal Church in order to have these things done. Now, some of the young Methodist congregations wanted ministers of their own, but the Bishop of London refused to appoint them and kept the power in the Episcopal Church. So reluctantly, John Wesley ordained Thomas Coke and gave him authority to ordain other ministers. Now, let me just stop here and say something. John Wesley did this, and he made the break from the Episcopal Church, but who gave John Wesley the authority to ordain Thomas Coke to be able to ordain more ministers? Where did that authority come from? Well, it came from authority that he just assumed himself, not from any special thing from heaven or anything like that. And this would be true with numerous other groups that we could talk about that came to America in the same way. So at what was known as the Christmas Conference, because it was on December 24th in 1784, Thomas Coke read a letter from Wesley stating that the churches in America were separated from any connection with either the government of England or the Church of England. So the Methodists became independent at that very time. And Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury were appointed joint superintendents over the Methodist churches in America. And the Baptist churches also came to America. John Smith, the clergyman of the Church of England, became a reformer. And as a result, he had to flee to Amsterdam because of the persecution he encountered in England. Here he affiliated himself with the English Separatists, as they were called, which was a large group of various kinds. But he was excommunicated from them because of his opposition to infant baptism. So he baptized himself by pouring water on his head. And he also baptized a man by the name of Thomas Helwys and some others, thus forming the First Baptist Church. In 1612, Thomas Helwys returned to London and founded what appears to be the First Baptist Church in England. They were called General Baptists, which was a term to indicate that they were Arminian in theology and not a part of the Calvinistic theology of predestination and election. Now, the first particular, as opposed to general, the first particular or Calvinistic Baptist church began in London a few years later in about 1633. Roger Williams, who broke away from the Congregational Church in America and was banished from the Massachusetts colony, probably established the First Baptist Church in America in about 1639 in Rhode Island. Now, there were other religious bodies that came to America, and I just mentioned some of the main ones. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the lesson, from the time of the Reformation movement on to 1800 and after, the tendency was to divide into more and more denominations. If you go down to 1957, and I think I mentioned this a couple of lessons ago, the Bureau of Census listed 258 different groups and listed 57 other groups with membership too scattered to obtain statistics. And even there's been many religious groups that have come into existence even from that time. So although many ideas have developed to justify religious division, many religious groups then began to start pushing for unity or ecumenism, as they called it, because such division cannot really be justified by the Holy Scriptures. In fact, Jesus' prayer in the garden, if you read that, would certainly tell you that he did not ordain a division in the concept of denominationalism. In John 17, when Jesus is praying for his apostles, he said, I do not ask in behalf of these alone, but for those also who believe in me through their word, or through the apostles' word, that they may be one, even as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that you did send me. And so Jesus prayed for unity, and much of the Bible talks about unity. And some of the people began to see that and propose that unity then try to be brought back to the concept of Christianity. Now, here are some of the bases for unity. I want to mention about three at this time. One would be authoritarian. This is the concept most clearly seen in the Catholic Church. Submit to the hierarchy of the church and accept whatever traditions or doctrines it imposes without question. In other words, we'll tell you what to do. We have the clergy. We'll tell you what to do. We have the priesthood. You just do what we tell you to do, and everything will be all right. Now, what you have to do this is a closed mind. You can't think for yourself and do that. You have to let other people do all the thinking for you. And the other idea for unity was interdenominational, or sometimes referred to as non-denominational. And the idea there is that there's no divine pattern in the New Testament for organization, for doctrine, or for worship. So belief in Jesus and piety of life, or living a righteous lifestyle, is the main basis for fellowship. What this requires you to do then is to ignore any doctrinal preaching. In fact, I've heard some Bible study groups that people that are involved in those say, well, we don't study any doctrine. We just read the Bible, we study the Bible, we don't study any doctrine. I don't know how you can do that. I've never figured out how you can read the Bible and study the Bible without ever studying any doctrine. It seems an impossible thing to me, but some say they do that. And then the third concept is an undenominational basis or concept. And that is the idea that the New Testament then contains the pattern for salvation, for worship, for organization of the church, for the doctrine, for the work of the church, and is the final source of authority in all things that is to be practiced in the church. So the authority of Christ and the Scripture becomes the basis then for all unity. Now, that's the only way that I know that you can unify under the authority of God. Otherwise, you're unifying under the authority of some people or some spiritual organization that has been established by men. But if you want to unify under the authority of God, you have to go to the Scriptures for that. So that brings us down to the point of talking about some of the early American restorers. This part of the study will follow the direction of some men toward the concept of undenominational Christianity in America. There have been restoration movements in other countries at various times. Some of those we have discovered. And no doubt there are some that have happened in many places of the world that we don't know anything about at all. So the leaders of the Reformation in Europe did not start out with the intention of forming denominational churches. That wasn't their concept. That wasn't what they started out to do. What they started out to do was try to reform the Catholic Church. Luther, in fact, told his followers not to call themselves Lutherans, but to call themselves just Christians. Now, as these reformers began their reforms, or tried to reform the Catholic Church, they had to defend their teachings, usually by writing them down. And when they did this, this crystallized their progress and institutionalized their fellowships. Succeeding generations then would refer to their interpretations and defended their conclusions. And only after much division did some people then begin to see the need for unity and the concept of restoration. One of the first in America to do that was a man by the name of James O'Kelly. He was from the Methodist Church and started about 1775. James O'Kelly was among the first in America then to see this need, and he began preaching in 1775 as a lay preacher in the Episcopal Church. But after reading the writings of John Wesley, who really exalted the Bible as authoritative and all sufficient for faith and practice, he joined the Wesleyan Society and began to work as a traveling minister. Now, I find it interesting that John Wesley did this. Now, to declare something and to put it into practice is two different things. And sometimes the practice never really follows the declaration. And that was the problem in much of the Reformation movement. Now, excuse me. O'Kelly opposed Thomas Asbury and the Episcopal form of government at this Christmas conference that I mentioned earlier that happened in 1784. And this is when the name Methodist Episcopal Church was selected for the Wesleyan societies that had been established in America. And his opposition continued for several years until he finally withdrew from the Methodist Church on December 24th in 1793, which was about 9 years later. A number of preachers followed O'Kelly in his stand, and they called themselves Republican Methodists after they withdrew. These brethren met again in the summer of 1794 in Virginia. And during this meeting, there was a man by the name of Rice Haggard. And he stood up with his Bible in his hand, and he pleaded that the Bible itself be accepted as their only creed. He moved that they call themselves Christians only, as the early disciples did. His motion was accepted, and so they drew up 5 cardinal principles in what they call the Christian church that they formed. Here they are. First, Christ is the only head of the church. Secondly, the name Christian is the only acceptable name. 3, the Bible is the only rule of faith. 4, Christian character is the only rule of fellowship. And 5, the right of private judgment is the privilege of all. Now, these are good concepts, good ideas. They're headed in the right direction. The basic difference between this Christian church that they started and the Methodist Church was basically one of organization. It didn't change the doctrines all that much. And so you see, the important thing here was that a set of principles were drawn up, some concepts, some ideas, and these concepts and ideas then began to be taught, and they sprang up in other places. It was an attitude of going to the Bible alone for that which was to be taught and practiced. And that was an important step toward restoration. Now, this group kind of faded out, and the remnants eventually merged with a later group which was referred to as the Stone Movement. The second man I want to talk about is a man by the name of Abner Jones, who was a Baptist. Abner Jones was a doctor in Vermont, and he was a member of the Free Will Baptist Church. The Free Will Baptist Church is not Calvinistic. And he became convinced that sectarian names and human creeds should be abandoned, and that true piety alone and not the externals of it should be the test of Christian fellowship and communion. With this conviction, he left the Baptist Church, and he established a congregation in Linden, Vermont in 1801, and he called it the Christian Church. Interesting that they would go to this concept again. This group took the Bible as their only creed and Christian as their only name, and soon made significant strides toward the concept of undenominational Christianity. Now, there was, shortly after that, another Baptist preacher by the name of Elias Smith joined Abner Jones, and they established churches all throughout New England area. As they worked, other preachers gave up denominationalism and joined this undenominational undertaking. And so they established a number of churches, and later on, these churches also merged with the Stone Movement. Let me mention one more by the name, a man by the name of John Wright, who was also a Baptist, and this was a little later, about 10 years later in 1810. So as the American frontier moved west, undenominational ideas moved with it. In 1810, John Wright began to organize Baptist churches in Indiana, which were free from human articles of faith. Soon, 10 congregations were established and organized into what was called the Blue River Association. This was the organization that oversaw these 10 churches. So Wright contended for the Word of God as the only rule of faith and opposed all human creeds as heretical, or being wrong to use. Now, when Wright began to put these ideas into practice, he soon saw that the name Baptist was not in the Scriptures as a name for the church. And so he dropped that name. And whenever he also was doing that, he saw that there was no authority for an organization above the local congregation. So he dropped the Blue River Association also and dissolved it for the very same reason. They also then merged with the Stone movement. Now, I'm going to leave you hanging for a while, for about 2 weeks, I guess, because we have another guest speaker this next Sunday evening, because I've mentioned the Stone movement at least 3 times. And I'm going to wait until the next lesson to talk about Barton W. Stone and his movement, which absorbed many of these early movements that I've been talking about. But none of the churches established by O'Kelly and Jones and Smith or John Wright became true New Testament churches in their form of teaching. But these men saw the concept of restoration, and they moved toward that concept of restoration. And they laid down some of the early principles and some of the early teaching that caught on with others, that led others to this concept of restoration. Now, to be fair, they built on the foundation of the English and European reformers and what they had done. Without restoration, the teaching that they had done, they would have had really no platform to launch from. And so you see, the restoration movement brought some ideas that led to the Reformation movement, I should say, brought some ideas that led to restoration. Now, restoration principles and teachings then began to spring up as a result of these ideas in different men, and many of them later merged together, as I mentioned, into the Stone movement and into other groups. So this shortly led to a true restoration movement on the early frontier. The concept of getting back to the Bible and the Bible only, and using it for all things that was done in religion as the authority. And so the churches of Christ then are a result actually of this movement. The concept is not to establish a new church, as had been done time after time after time. The concept is to go back beyond all of that to the Bible itself and look at what was established there in the first century, to look at the church that Jesus established there and say, how can we bring a congregation, how can we establish a congregation of the church that Jesus established today? And you do that by bringing the Word of God and going to the Word of God only and using it as your only authority. So if we can get people to see the importance of the first century connected to the 21st century, rather than just looking at the past as something archaic and useless and out of date, we can get people to see the concept of New Testament Christianity and of the restoration principles in which you can establish New Testament Christianity anywhere in the world, with simply bringing the Word and the authority of Christ together and using it to practice that which Christ established on this earth from the very beginning. And this is what we should do and should be doing, and this is the concept. Now, let me go back to 2 Chronicles again, where this concept of restoration was brought out in restoring the temple and restoring the practice of Judaism in the Old Covenant under the kingship of Joash. Now, it says down in verse 15, after this happened, and this worked for a long period of time. It says, now when Jehoiada reached a ripe old age, he died, and was 130 years old at his death. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done well in Israel, and to God, and to his house. But after the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them. And they abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and served the Asherim and the idols. So wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for their guilt, and eventually they went into Babylonian captivity. So what they did was abandoned restoration and moved back in the opposite direction again from which they had come whenever they needed restoration. And it's possible to do that. And unfortunately, there are some now in the restoration movement who are saying restoration principles are not really working. They won't work. They're not really a biblical concept. And what we need to do is to go back to denominationalism. Now that is a sad concept, because it does work. It is a Bible principle, and it's not just here. It's in numerous places that you read throughout the Scriptures. So let me encourage you to embrace the Holy Scriptures as your authority, and the authority of Jesus Christ through these Scriptures as the head of the church, the only head of the church, and his teachings as the concepts, the doctrines that we need to go to in order to establish everything that we do as far as salvation, as far as worship, as far as the organization of the church, and all the other things we practice as far as Christianity is concerned, including our personal lifestyle. Now, if you're not doing this, then we encourage you to come along with us, because this is what we are doing, and we believe this will lead us to heaven and make us successful whenever we reach the judgment and the resurrection. So we encourage you to come with us. And if you're not on that route, let me encourage you to come now, and we'll help you in whatever way we can as we stand and sing the invitation song at this time.